Welcome to the London Free Press Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Gilbert. There were lots of tears and remorse during a sentencing hearing this week for an impaired driver who killed her friend. So today I'm talking with London Free Press court reporter Jane Sims about the death of 23-year-old Beulah Peters and the sentencing of Kelly Jacobs. And we're also going to talk a little bit about Jane's career as a court reporter towards the end of the podcast. So hi, Jane. How are you?
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you. This is the first time that I've had you on, so I'm glad that we've got this opportunity. Unfortunately, we're never talking about good things, I assume, when we're talking with you. And this case is no different. So let's just kind of go over the case first of all. What happened the night that Beulah Peters was killed? Kelly Jacobs and Beulah Peters were out partying. This was the night of December 2nd, 2018. So just kind of set the scene for us. What were they doing that night before this crash?
Sure. Here's what we heard during the trial, which was last fall. Kelly Jacobs was out with Beulah Peters and some other friends. They had gotten together to go to Tiger Jack's in South London, driven there. There was evidence of a lot of drinking. There was evidence of them heading back to Chippewa and Muncie, just southwest of the city. There was evidence of some poor driving. One of the occupants got out of the truck at home, and the rest of them carried on a booze cruise out on the reserve, meaning that they were driving around and drinking. At one point, they stopped. There was an argument that took place between Beulah Peters and Ms. Jacobs, and she got out of the truck and she was going to walk home on Jubilee Road. The evidence at the trial was fascinating because she was texting her sister as she was walking home. So there was a good timeline there to see how far she was and what she was doing. And what happened, according to the witnesses at the trial, was that the truck followed her, stop, get out, talk to her, beg her to come back in the truck. She wouldn't, kept walking. Then they'd go after her again. And eventually what happened is she was almost home and was walking on a road that was actually, it's paved, but it's narrow and there's a ravine. And again, she was wearing a bright pink jacket. One of the witnesses who was in the truck said that she could see her and told Ms. Jacobs to slow down, but it was too late and she hit her. Beulah Peters died of a catastrophic brain injury. There were other things during the trial that were, it was an unusual situation. There was an ambulance nearby going to a non-emergency event who happened upon this scene. There was evidence of Ms. Jacobs being belligerent and to the paramedics and eventually to the police officers who showed up. And there was a lot of chaos. Ms. Peters' parents came to the scene because they were right near there. And they took Ms. Peters to the hospital. They took Ms. Jacobs to the OPP. And in the chaos and what was happening, Ms. Jacobs was put into a cell at the OPP and was released the next morning, and there was no breathalyzer ever taken. Wow. So that became a big issue at the trial. But as Justice Thomas said yesterday, there was plenty of evidence that pointed to severe impairment, and he had no problem with the jury's verdict that there was impaired driving causing death. Now, she was acquitted of a couple of other charges, but the main one, which is the big one, was the impaired death, and that is what she was being sentenced for yesterday. What was interesting at the sentencing, and of course I want to preface this with the fact that I've sat through a lot of impaired driving causing death cases, and they all run on a similar trajectory. It's usually the accused or the convicted person. The driver is, someone who's a pro-social, person, usually without a criminal record, who decided to get into a car and drive drunk. This is not a case where you're dealing with hardened criminals. You're dealing with people who have found themselves in a situation and making a decision that has been a terrible decision. And
Right.
that came through yesterday too. I mean, we had victim impact statements from Ms. Peters' family, one of whom is her sister. And I can just as a sidebar, her sister, I covered her trial just last month, and she was convicted of impaired driving causing death for a separate incident involving. It was about a year and a half later.
Wow.
Um,
A year and a
yeah,
half after her sister was killed by an impaired driver, she was
yes,
convicted of impaired driving?
she was arrested. Yeah, she was
Arrested.
arrested a year and a half after her sister died. She was arrested for impaired driving causing death
Wow.
and was convicted by a jury last month.
Hmm.
Um, and also, it was actually kind of an unusual sentencing hearing in that um, usually during sentencing hearings, you will get letters of reference, for example, letters of support from people. Those are usually filed with the judge. The judge reads them. Um, the defense may make some reference to them, obviously, but in this case, they were all read in. And the pitch from the defense was for a conditional sentence, taking into account what we call Gladue factors. Indigenous offenders are given are on request, they can have something called a Gladue report, which is a specialized pre-sentence report, which looks into the impact and effects of colonialism and residential schools and and abuse and neglect that has had on the person's life and
Sure.
in their life history.
Hmm.
Um, it is not a free pass. I think that's one thing that the public needs to understand. A Gladue report is not a free pass. There has to be some demonstrated effect that the upbringing and heritage has had on the person that has led them to that point. I
Sure.
just say that as an aside.
So she did
Um,
ask for, Miss Jacobs did ask for a
oh
Gladue
yeah,
report. Yeah.
yeah. I think it was a 27 page report. They're always very lengthy and they're very in depth and they yes they go into the person's background, not just their immediate background, but their generational background as well. It's
Okay.
very interesting.
Sure.
Um, However, in her case, she was raised in a very, it's limited. That was the impression I got. There is a limited connection to the type of abuse and neglect and addiction that we see in other cases. Justice Thomas said it himself. He said, I see cases of Indigenous offenders all the time who were witness to abuse every day of their childhood. And to quote him, he says, that's not Kelly Jacobs.
Right.
She
Okay.
has a diploma from Fanshawe. She has a job with the health center. She is a valued employee there. The idea of a conditional sentence that was put forward by the defense was to give her a chance to rehabilitate at home, that she's paid a price and she's remorseful.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is this. We live in southwestern Ontario, which is kind of, if I use a phrase, ground zero for impaired driving causing death cases. We changed law here for the country here in southwestern Ontario because of the number of tragedies that shouldn't have happened.
Wow.
And that began, as far as increasing the tariff for impaired driving, happened around I want to say 2010, might have been 2008. It was a case here in town of a young man who crashed his pickup truck into another pickup truck. It was a fiery crash. 2 children died, and a guy and his friend died. And he was given an 8-year sentence, and that was unheard of. But it pushed the Court of Appeal to say these cases need to be taken seriously, and if you're going to drive drunk, you're going to go to prison.
Why are there so many of those cases here in this area?
Well, because people haven't learned their lesson, I guess. I don't know, Rachel. I mean,
Right.
like one of the things that the courts try to do when they're sentencing on these cases, and if you'll recall what I said about these people are usually good people who haven't done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be something called general deterrence, and general deterrence means sending a message to the community that says, if you drive drunk and you kill somebody, you're going to prison.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And you would hope that would happen, but like I always find when I'm sitting in court during these cases, they'll do a review of the case law. And I know that those of us who cover court will sit there, we can count off as they do them all the cases that we've covered. That we know these cases because we were sitting in the courtroom when these people were sentenced.
Right.
And so the Crown is asking for 7 years in this case. The defense is asking for a conditional sentence, asking the judge to take into account Indigenous heritage. And this is a person who, rehabilitation wise, would do better living in the community or going to, in the alternative, she's already received confirmation that she could go to a healing lodge.
Okay. So I was going to ask you what would be involved in the conditional sentencing. What would be the difference between in the community and going to the healing lodge for her?
Well, she'd be receiving the healing lodge would be a 1 year rehabilitation program for alcoholism and mental health issues.
Okay.
And that these are restorative justice principles are something that the particularly for Indigenous offenders, because they are overrepresented in our criminal justice system. These are measures that these are options that are out there that need to be tapped into. This case is an impaired driving causing death case. This is a little bit different. So I think for Justice Thomas, I mean, I'm curious to see how he handles this. He did make it clear though that he has no trouble. There was some, let me back up. There was some efforts on the part of the defense to point out that Beulah Peters was impaired. It was a narrow road. It was dark. There were no skid marks. However, I don't know how much difference that makes. Sure. And clearly, the fact that she was impaired really doesn't make any difference, right? In terms of Ms. Peters. So,
sure. Yeah,
we'll see what he does. It's again one of the many cases of impaired driving causing death that we see across the region, and it's one too many. Once again, it just does not seem to dissipate.
Right. There were several people in the car with them when Miss Peters was hit, and and so a lot of them had testified along with the paramedics and the police officers that were there that night. And I wondered if you knew what the argument between Miss Jacobs and Miss Peters was about. Was Miss Peters at all worried about her driving and wanted to get out of the car for that? Do we know anything about that?
I don't think that's what it is. I think everybody had a lot to drink. Right.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of gaps in memory, and they were also in collision, right? So there were some gaps in memory, and yeah, it wasn't specific, right? They'd all been drinking quite a bit.
Yeah. And the other thing which you did mention is that there was no breathalyzer test given that night. Was that a main focus of this trial?
Absolutely. I mean, and even yesterday, the defense brought up the fact that there was no readings. And that's when Justice Thomas said there is a lot of evidence here of impairment, that you don't need that blood alcohol content reading to convict somebody of impaired driving. And that's absolutely true, right? That's, it's more than just a number. It's more than just an over 80 milligrams of alcohol and 100 milliliters of blood. Absolutely. There's lots of indication that someone is impaired, and you can convict on that.
Sure. So she hasn't been sentenced yet. When will we hear about that?
Well, Justice Thomas has set May 12th as sentencing date. So that'll be yes, he will deliver his decision then. Sure. So he needs some time. He needs some time to write it and craft it and think it through. This is a pretty routine way that these cases fall. Right. Yes.
Jane, and we'll certainly watch for your updates because I know you'll be there to hear what the sentence is on May 12th. But I want to talk about your career because personally, it fascinates me that you are in court every day covering these cases. I'm assuming you don't hear a lot of good news in your day to day.
Well, I think I'd put it this way. I meet a lot of really nice people. Let me put it that way. And I often say to families, that will talk to me, who give me who are kind enough to talk to me when I'm covering these cases, that I meet an awful lot of nice people under very bad circumstances, because I meet them on the worst days of their lives often. However, I do think court reporting, beyond the fact that it's good storytelling, which I always fall back to, it's also a really important reflection of what's going on in the community, and it gives some sense of who we are and the issues that we're facing. And I think about that a lot. The impaired driving case is just one example, but the proliferation of gun violence in this city, we're seeing more guns come through. The trafficking of fentanyl, we're seeing a lot of fentanyl traffickers come through. You get a sense of of the trends that are affecting the city in a broader sense, simply by what's happening in courtrooms. Sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
Is court reporting a privilege or a burden, do you think?
Oh, it's a privilege, right? I mean, I had a judge say to me many years ago when I started this, that, sometimes you might feel like she didn't say this, but this is what you sometimes feel like. You feel a little bit like an interloper sitting there, right? Because there's people there who are all there for a purpose. But she said to me, don't ever feel like that, because reporters, journalists are as important as the judges and the lawyers and the court clerks and registrars and officers, and simply because without court reporting, we don't know what happens there. We're the megaphone to say, this is what's going on in your community.
Yeah.
The work doesn't mean much unless people know about it, right? So that's why you do it. That's why we cover court. Do we get good stories out of it? Absolutely. There's no question about that. But it is whatever journalism always is. It's a witness to history, right? I mean, There have been monumental cases that I've had the privilege to cover, that have really meant something to this city.
Absolutely.
The Bandito massacre comes to mind for me always. In Chatham, Kent, it's the Father Sylvester case. These are really important issues that needed to be litigated and also needed to be covered.
Yeah.
So
do you ever bring it home with you? Does it affect you in any way? Have you learned
probably, to? I'm not going to say it doesn't, but
yeah.
You learn how to compartmentalize it, right?
Yeah.
Work is work and home is home, right? I've been lucky enough to be a mom, so that
can take your mind off it a little bit.
Well, because I think police officers, doctors, lawyers, everybody does the same thing. And once you take that hat off, once you walk back in, right?
I feel like I could ask you questions all day, but I did ask you this one last question, and I asked you off camera first. Do you even like people anymore? After seeing kind of the worst of the worst, you did say that you meet some really great people too, but do you like people? What do you think of people now in general?
Oh, you know what? I'm not going to say I don't like people. I like people, but I am constantly amazed at the creativity that goes into the thoughts of some people on how to hurt somebody else. I'm amazed by that. I mean, I think, wow, how did you dream that up, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It really does kind of floor me at times. That when you're covering stories that there's I think the thing is too about covering court is that I think that there is a general idea that you broke the law, so therefore you go to jail. It's very nuanced. The words on the page are one thing, but the actual thing that happens is something else.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and there's all kinds of elements that contribute to that. It can be mental illness, it can be addiction, it can be poverty, it can be physical abuse, it can be sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what motivates people or what makes them who they are pushes them in that direction. It isn't always, it's not so easy as to say lock somebody up and throw away the key. I mean,
Right.
we need to look at people for who they are and craft their future in a way that they can be productive members of our society.
Yeah,
So
that's well
I
put.
think that's the way I look at it. I mean, I've seen cases of young people who've been given, you know, second chances, and they've made it work, right?
Yeah.
So,
And
you
that's the
know, it's
positive from your job, right? You can see those
sure,
things, which is nice.
and it's also a positive to know that we're thinking about uh, justice in a different way all the time, right?
Yeah.
And looking at new alternatives and and realizing, you know, that sometimes, you know, I'll take the pandemic as an example. It became abundantly clear from the very beginning that housing everybody out in a crowded jail in South London was not a good idea during a pandemic, and we needed to
Right.
find creative ways to handle that. And
Yep.
we did, right? You know, the other part I will say is that probably the biggest change I've seen happen during the pandemic is the fact that the criminal justice system has been dragged kicking and screaming into technology.
Mm.
But now I can tune into a court by Zoom. Certain courts will still let me tune in by Zoom to watch what's happening. I don't have to make those trips down to the courthouse as much. Most for bigger cases, obviously they happen in person. But we figured out that if somebody's just making a routine appearance, they don't have to be there, right?
Right.
We can do it by Zoom. We can do things in completely creative ways that doesn't take away from the whole process.
Right.
So,
Expedites things too a little bit, I bet.
well, that's probably been the biggest change I've seen over 20
Hmm.
years of covering this. So,
Wow.
or 22. Yeah, but anyway, yeah.
We won't count. We won't count. Well, Jane, thank you so much. I'm sure there's more. There's so much more we could talk about, but we will definitely watch for your stories on lfpress.com. The sentencing for Miss Jacobs is out on May 12th, so we'll watch for your story on that for sure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.